The Rusty Spoon Diner sat on the edge of Maplewood, a small Ohio town where the smell of coffee and bacon grease hung heavy in the air. It was just past 7 a.m., and the morning rush filled the place with the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation. At a corner booth, 76-year-old Korean War veteran Frank Sullivan adjusted his worn baseball cap, the faded words USS Midway stitched across it. His hands, scarred from shrapnel and years of hard labor, steadied a cup of black coffee as he watched the world go by. Frank's eyes, sharp despite his age, carried a quiet pride, but also a flicker of weariness from a lifetime of carrying the war's weight. Frank wasn't here for the food today. He'd come to do something kind, something that warmed his heart. In his jacket pocket was a small envelope with $50, his last bit of cash from his pension check. He'd overheard a young waitress, Jenny, talking about her son's broken wheelchair, how she couldn't afford the repairs. Frank, who'd fixed up old Jeeps in the Navy, had spent the morning tinkering with the chair in his garage, getting it rolling smooth again. The money was to cover new parts he'd bought out of pocket. He figured it was the least he could do for a single mom who always greeted him with a smile. As Jenny passed by, balancing a tray of pancakes, Frank waved her over, his voice gruff but warm. "Jenny, got a second?" he asked, pulling out the envelope. "Fixed your boy's chair. This is for the parts. No kid should be stuck without wheels." His lips curved into a rare smile, the kind that made his weathered face look 10 years younger. Jenny's eyes widened, her hand trembling as she took the envelope. "Mr. Sullivan, I don't know what to say," she stammered, tears welling up. A few regulars nearby clapped softly, moved by the gesture. For a moment, the diner felt like a community, a place where kindness still mattered. But the warmth didn't last. The diner's manager, Carl Baxter, a wiry man with a permanent scowl and a reputation for pinching pennies, stormed over from the counter. His eyes narrowed at Frank, who sat calmly sipping his coffee. "What's this?" Carl snapped, snatching the envelope from Jenny's hand before she could tuck it away. "You giving out money now, old man? This ain't a charity." His voice dripped with contempt, loud enough to turn heads. The diner went quiet, forks pausing mid-air. Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone steady. "It's my money, Carl. I fixed her kid's chair. Ain't your business." His words carried the weight of a man who'd faced enemy fire, but Carl wasn't impressed. He leaned in, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes. "Veterans like you always think you're special, huh? Flashing your war stories, expecting handouts." He tore the envelope in half, letting the bills flutter to the floor. "Get out. You're disturbing my customers." The diner erupted in gasps. Jenny froze, her face pale, while a few patrons muttered in shock. A trucker at the counter growled, "That's low, Carl," but others stayed silent, unwilling to challenge the man who signed their checks. Frank's heart pounded, a familiar ache from decades of being dismissed, first by bureaucrats who shorted his benefits, now by this small-town tyrant. He knelt slowly, his bad knee creaking to pick up the torn bills, each movement a blow to his dignity. "I fought for this country," he said quietly, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I don't need your permission to help someone." Carl laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Fought? That was 50 years ago. Nobody cares, Grandpa." He turned to Jenny, his voice icy. "Pick that up or you're fired." Jenny hesitated, her eyes darting to Frank, torn between fear and gratitude. Frank shook his head slightly, signaling her to stay out of it. He stood, his hands trembling as he clutched the torn money, his pride battered but unbroken. Inside, doubt gnawed at him. Had he been naive to think kindness could cut through a world so quick to judge? As Frank headed for the door, a young regular named Marcus, a mechanic who'd fixed Frank's old pickup once, stood up. "This ain't right," Marcus said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Frank's a hero. You don't treat him like trash." Carl waved him off, but Marcus pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. "This is going on X," he muttered, snapping a photo of the torn bills on the floor. The post read, "Veteran humiliated at Rusty Spoon Diner for helping a mom. Manager tore up his money. Shameful." It started gaining traction, reposts piling up from locals who knew Frank's quiet strength. Outside, Frank leaned against his rusty Ford, the cold morning air biting his face. The sting of Carl's words echoed in his mind, dragging up memories of the war, nights on the USS Midway, the roar of jets, the friends he'd lost. He'd survived all that, only to be spat on in his own town. But as he looked at the diner, he saw Jenny watching him through the window, her eyes full of gratitude. Marcus joined him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "We got your back, Frank," he said. "This ain't over." Frank nodded, his resolve hardening like steel in a forge. He'd faced worse than Carl Baxter, and he wasn't done fighting. Not for himself, not for Jenny, not for every veteran who'd ever been pushed aside. As he drove off, Marcus's post spread like wildfire, catching the eye of Maplewood's tight-knit community. The stage was set, and the battle for justice was just beginning. We only started this story, but trust me, it's about to get even more intense. Stay tuned to see what happens when Frank faces even greater injustice. The Rusty Spoon diner buzzed with tension, the air thick with the scent of grease and the weight of confrontation. Frank Sullivan, the 76-year-old Korean War veteran, stood just outside the diner's glass doors, his weathered hands clutching the torn remnants of the $50 he'd tried to give Jenny for her son's wheelchair. His USS Midway cap sat low on his brow, shadowing eyes that burned with a mix of hurt and defiance. The humiliation from Carl Baxter, the diner's manager, stung like a fresh wound, but Frank wasn't the type to back down. He'd faced North Korean artillery. A small-town bully wasn't going to break him. Inside the diner was a pressure cooker. Patrons whispered, some outraged by Carl's cruelty, others siding with him out of fear or apathy. Jenny, the young waitress, hovered near the counter, her face pale as she glanced at the torn bills still scattered on the floor. Carl, his scowl deeper than ever, barked orders at her. "Clean that up now," he snapped, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Jenny knelt, her hands shaking, but her eyes kept darting to the door where Frank stood, a silent apology in her gaze. Frank took a deep breath, his chest tight with the weight of the moment. He'd come here to do a good deed, to help a struggling mom, but now he was a spectacle, a veteran reduced to a punchline. Doubt gnawed at him. Maybe he was too old, too out of touch to make a difference. But then he thought of Jenny's son, stuck without a working chair, and his resolve hardened. He pushed the door open and stepped back inside, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. The diner went quiet, all eyes on him. "Carl," Frank said, his voice low but steady, like the rumble of a distant storm. "You owe Jenny an apology, and you owe me the respect I earned." He held up the torn bills, his hands steady despite the tremor of anger running through him. "This was for her kid. You don't get to destroy that." Carl laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made Frank's skin crawl. "Respect? For what? Some old war stories?" He stepped closer, his face inches from Frank's. "You're nothing but a has-been, Sullivan. Get out before I call the cops." The threat hung heavy, and a few patrons shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty to Carl wavering. Marcus, the mechanic who'd posted about the incident on X, stood up from his booth, his phone still in hand. "You're digging your own grave, Carl," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "This is all over the internet now." The post Marcus had made was gaining traction, with dozens of reposts and comments flooding in from Maplewood locals and beyond. "Disgusting treatment of a veteran at Rusty Spoon," one read. "Boycott this place," another demanded. The diner's phone began to ring, unanswered, as customers outside the loop started calling in, their voices muffled but angry. Carl's face twitched, but he doubled down, pointing at Frank. "You're causing a scene, old man. Leave, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Before Frank could respond, the door swung open, and two local police officers stepped in. Officer Daniels, a young rookie with a nervous expression, and Officer Hayes, a grizzled veteran who'd known Frank for years. Hayes's eyes widened when he saw Frank. But Carl jumped in first, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Officers, this man's disrupting my business, harassing my staff. Get him out." He gestured at the torn bills, spinning a lie. He threw money on the floor, made a mess. Frank's heart sank. He'd dealt with cops like this before, quick to judge, slow to listen. But Hayes stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Frank's. "That true, Frank?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes searching. Frank shook his head, his voice calm but firm. "I was helping Jenny. Fixed her boy's wheelchair. Gave her money for parts." Carl tore it up, threw it away. He held up the mangled bills as proof, his hands steady now, fueled by a fire he hadn't felt since the war. Jenny, still kneeling, spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. "It's true, officer. Mr. Sullivan was just being kind. Carl, he got mad." Her words hung in the air, and the crowd murmured, some nodding in support. Daniels, the rookie, looked uncertain, but Hayes's face hardened as he turned to Carl. You tore up his money? He asked, his tone sharp. Carl shrugged, his confidence faltering. He was causing trouble, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by Marcus's ex-post, which now had hundreds of reposts. A local news van pulled up, and a reporter, Sarah Lopez, rushed in with a cameraman, her microphone ready. "Mr. Baxter," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "we're getting reports of a veteran being mistreated here. Care to explain?" The camera zoomed in on Carl, whose face turned beet red. He stammered, "This is a misunderstanding," but the crowd wasn't buying it. A few regulars began chanting, "Justice for Frank," their voices growing louder. Frank stood tall, his USS Midway cap a quiet badge of honor. Inside, he wrestled with a storm of emotions: anger at Carl, shame at being humiliated, fear that he'd let Jenny down. But the crowd's support, the camera's glare, and Hayes' steady gaze gave him strength. He stepped forward, addressing Carl directly. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice ringing clear. "I don't need your approval to do what's right, but you will not disrespect me or Jenny again." The diner erupted in applause, and Carl's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of fear. Marcus held up his phone, showing the ex-post now trending locally, with comments pouring in. "Support our veterans!" "Shame on Rusty Spoon!" Sarah's camera captured it all, broadcasting the scene to Maplewood and beyond. Officer Hayes turned to Carl, his voice low but firm. "We're not done here, Baxter. Hand over those bills." Carl hesitated, then scooped the torn money from the floor, his hands shaking as he passed it to Hayes. The crowd cheered, but Frank's eyes stayed on Carl, searching for a hint of remorse and finding none. As the tension peaked, Jenny stood, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan," she whispered, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Frank nodded, his throat tight. He'd come to help a kid, but now he was fighting for something bigger: his dignity, his community, his right to be seen. The diner doors swung open again, and more locals poured in, their voices joining the chant. The stage was set for a reckoning, and Frank wasn't backing down. "We're on the edge of the climax. What happens next will turn everything upside down. You simply can't miss the resolution of this story." The Rusty Spoon Diner in Maplewood was a battlefield of clashing voices and raw emotions, the air electric with outrage and anticipation. Frank Sullivan, the 76-year-old Korean War veteran, stood at the center of the storm, his USS Midway cap tilted back, revealing eyes that held both the weight of war and a flicker of unyielding resolve. The torn $50 bills he'd meant for Jenny's son's wheelchair were now in Officer Hayes' hands, a symbol of the indignity Frank had endured. The diner's manager, Carl Baxter, stood cornered by the counter, his face flushed as the crowd's chants of "Justice for Frank" grew deafening. The news camera, wielded by reporter Sarah Lopez, captured every second, broadcasting the showdown to a town already buzzing from Marcus's viral ex-post. Carl's scowl faltered under the weight of the crowd's fury, but he doubled down, pointing a shaky finger at Frank. "This is my diner!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "You're all trespassing now! Get out!" His words were drowned by boos, and Jenny, the young waitress, stepped forward, her voice trembling but fierce. "You're wrong, Carl. Mr. Sullivan was helping my son. You're the one who should leave." The crowd roared in agreement, and Carl's confidence crumbled, his eyes darting to the officers for support. Officer Hayes, a veteran himself, held the torn bills up, his face stern. "Baxter, you tore up this man's money. You humiliated a hero. You got anything to say for yourself?" The rookie, Officer Daniels, shifted nervously, but Hayes' authority held the room. Frank stood tall, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and hope. He'd faced mortars in Korea, lost buddies to gunfire, yet this moment, standing up to a system that dismissed him, felt like his toughest fight yet. Inside, doubt lingered. Would his stand mean anything, or would Carl's cruelty win? Before Carl could respond, the diner's door burst open, and in strode Clara Thompson, a retired Navy captain and Maplewood's unofficial matriarch. Her silver hair was pulled back, and her presence commanded silence, her service medals glinting on her jacket. She'd seen Marcus's ex-post, now with thousands of reposts, and drove straight from her farm. "Frank Sullivan," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade, "is a man who risked his life for this country. And you, Carl Baxter, dare to spit on that?" The crowd erupted, and Sarah's camera swung to capture Clara's righteous fury. Clara turned to the crowd, her eyes blazing. "This isn't just about Frank. It's about every veteran who's been pushed aside, forgotten, mocked. She pointed at Carl, her voice rising. "You don't get to treat him like garbage. Not in my town." The crowd cheered, and Frank felt a surge of pride, tempered by the ache of years spent feeling invisible. He met Clara's gaze, nodding slightly, a silent thank you between warriors. Carl, now sweating profusely, stammered, "I didn't mean, it was a misunderstanding." But the lie fell flat. Sarah Lopez stepped closer, her microphone thrust forward. "Mr. Baxter, your actions are all over social media. People are calling for a boycott. What's your response?" The phone behind the counter rang nonstop, angry customers and locals flooding the line. Marcus held up his phone, showing the X post now trending nationally, with hashtags like #Justice4Frank and #SupportVeterans gaining traction. Officer Hayes handed the torn bills to Jenny, his voice firm. "These belong to you. And you," he turned to Carl, "are coming with us to explain this at the station." The crowd roared, and Daniels, finally finding his nerve, stepped forward to escort Carl. But Clara raised a hand, stopping them. "Wait," she said, her tone commanding. She turned to Frank, her eyes softening. "Frank, you tell us what you want. This is your moment." Frank took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. "I want Jenny's boy to have his chair fixed. I want Carl to apologize, not just to me, but to every veteran he's ever disrespected. And I want this town to remember what we fought for." His words hit like a thunderclap, and the crowd erupted, chanting his name. Jenny rushed forward, hugging Frank tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Sullivan," she whispered. "Thank you." Carl, cornered and defeated, muttered an apology, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it." The words were hollow, but the crowd's pressure and Clara's glare forced them out. Sarah's camera caught every second, and the footage would later air on local news, sparking a broader conversation about veterans' treatment. The diner's owner, alerted by the chaos, arrived minutes later, promising to replace the torn money and investigate Carl's conduct. Carl was led out by the officers, his head bowed, his authority shattered. As the crowd dispersed, Clara clasped Frank's shoulder. "You did us proud, sailor," she said, her voice warm. Frank nodded, his throat tight. "Just wanted to help a kid," he said softly, pulling out a photo of his own grandson, a Marine in training. The diner, now quieter, felt different, less like a battleground, more like a community waking up. Marcus's X post had ignited a movement, with locals organizing a fundraiser for Jenny's son and a petition for better veteran support. Frank stepped outside, the evening air cool against his face. He'd won this fight, not just for himself, but for every veteran who'd ever been dismissed. As he drove home, the torn bills replaced, and Jenny's gratitude warming his heart, he felt a quiet peace. Maplewood would remember this day, and so would Carl, whose forced apology was just the start of his reckoning. Frank's stand had lit a spark, one that would burn long after the diner's lights went out.